we got an email from one of our vendors, for lack of a better term, where there were pins left in 2 blankets. Obviously not our finest moment. So we do have the what? This sounded so great in my head last night when I wasn't sleeping. We have checks and balances in place to keep this from happening. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a little refresher course on how to make our blankets, and we're going to discuss how we can keep this from happening again. Because the last thing we want to do is to send out a blanket that has a pin in it. I mean, these are going to, in most cases, fragile children. So, they really don't want to be stuck by a frickin' pin. So we need to be a little more careful. Keep your thoughts and questions to the end, because we know I cannot keep a stray thought in my head for more than 5 seconds if I'm interrupted, unfortunately. So the first station we have is we are putting the batting, or the tops and backs, on the batting. So this is station 1. So I want everyone to look at this blanket. This blanket is done absolutely correctly. The pins are approximately 1 inch from the edge. That gives the sewer plenty of space to go all the way around. If you put your pins too close to the edge, there's a slight problem here. You're going to have to make sure that your top is smaller than your back. Because if the back is smaller, then the sewer has a problem and they'll miss this seam. So just keep that in mind when you cut it. Yeah, well, and I hate to make you repin, but you can cut this off. But then I would suggest, moving your pins back, because you want to make this as easy for the next station as possible. Now, so we want these pins to be about 1 inch from the edge, because we don't want the sewer to, 1, run them over, because that's bad for the machines, it's bad for the pins, it dulls the needles at the very least, and it's also possible to break the needles. All bad things. You also want 4 pins on a diagonal in each corner to secure the corner. Now the sewer will have to pull these out as she's going around. I'm saying she because we don't have any men. I tried to get them to volunteer, but they're not having it. So unless it's hammers and screws and nails, they're just not playing. The other thing to worry about is do not put your pins too far into the body of the quilt, because if the pins are too far up, the sewer doesn't see them, because they're just not there. They're not within their line of sight. So once this is trimmed and cut and put in the stack for the sewers, then it goes to station 2. So that's our first line of defense, pinning properly, making sure that all the edges are even and equal. It's okay on this one here, like if you want to leave this bottom piece a little bit longer, that's absolutely perfect, because that way the sewer can see that the bottom piece is here. They don't have to look to see if it's too short on the bottom half. But, just a little bit. You don't want to leave big giant hunks. All right, once it goes to station 2A, that is where we take the raw quilt and we sew around the outside. So here, you start on generally the longest edge, go all the way around. Now everyone has their own way of sewing. I have a tendency to pull the pins out as I sew. That can be problematic if you run out of bobbin. Some people leave the pins in all the way around, and then they pull them out later. Sometimes that's problematic because, unfortunately, you can miss a pin. The corners are rounded, and then when you get back to the side you started on, I generally leave an opening that's about like this. because I know that, you know, my hand has got to go in that hole and I've got to pull everything out. So once this is sewn, either the sewer or a third party, it can be either way, comes back, double checks to make sure there are no pins on the outside of the quilt, rounds off the corners with a scissors, reaches in there and pulls the entire product back through. That's weird. So that wrongs or right sides are now on the outside of the quilt and the batting is in between. Now the second check for pins at this station is to stick your hand, may I borrow this?
That's what it's getting ready to do.
Okay. Stick your hand in the opening and literally start at the opening and push all the way into the corner, and then take your hand and you're going to push the fabric out as you go. There's two reasons for this. One, you're actually pushing the seam as far out as it will go to make it easier for the top stitcher to sew without having these weird gaps, which if you're not pushing this seam out, you're going to get gaps. You're also pushing the corner out. And the third, and quite possibly most important thing that you're doing, again, you're going all the way around the inside of the quilt and making sure there are no pins. I mean, I hate to keep, you know, badgering on this subject, but okay. And I lost my edge. All right. So then you go all the way around and you come back to the seam on this side. And at this point, it depends on who's going to do the top stitching. And this is between you and your top stitcher. You can either fold this opening so that it would look like it's normally sewn and pin it into place, or you can leave it for the top stitcher to do that. And that's something that you can do. You can decide between yourselves. So then this goes to the section 2B, which is the top stitcher, who's going to then sew over this opening and then continue all the way around so that all the edges are secured. And then the top stitcher also has the responsibility of sewing the silky onto every Project Linus blanket. And this silky is what we get from headquarters, or what we buy, it's not get, what we buy from headquarters that designates this as a donated blanket from Project Linus. And this has to be on every blanket that we donate. All right, then that product, and while the third check is while the top stitcher is top stitching, she should also be checking to make sure that there are no pins, because we're all human. We all have other things on our mind. We all make mistakes. Sometimes you get interrupted. Sometimes you take a shortcut. I get it. I get it. I'm not trying to blame anybody. You know, the minute any one of us turns out to be perfect, we'll all go out and walk on water. But until that happens, you know, we're just going to have to do the best we can. All right, after the quilt has been top stitched and closed, then it gets folded up and it goes over on this pile here, awaiting a stringing. This is our final line of defense. And so we are relying on you guys as our quality control. That means that once the blanket is laying on your table, and I'm going to use this one as an example, before you start stringing, I want you to run your hands over it, just to double check to make sure there's nothing sticking out, no pins, no weird pieces. Sometimes, you know, when I put fabric together, I find staples in it because the person has stapled a note onto the fabric. It's annoying, but these are the things you're looking for. You're looking for staples, sharps, pins. So once you've decided that, go ahead and string it. Put on your paper tag with our Clark Center Blanketeers on it, obviously. Double check to make sure that there are no sewing strings left on it from the sewers. And I think that's it. But, you know, this has been, it's not one station's fault, it's not one person's fault, it's just, you know, we try to, it just happened. We try to get out as many blankets as we can because we know there's a need out there. We try to fulfill everyone's needs and wishes, but I'd rather send out one less blanket than to send out one that has a sharp in it. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Sometimes we come across a flaw in a blanket. Either a seam has opened up or it wasn't done properly to begin with, and we have a tendency to put a stick pin in that seam to mark it so that it can go back and be fixed by the sewers. Instead of putting a stick pin in it, let's get some, and I will get some safety pins, because God forbid, you know, we send out a blanket with a stick pin in it because it had to be fixed and we forgot. So let's instead use safety pins. At least it's a safety pin and not a stick pin. The other thing that we have a tendency to do, and I've seen this happen a lot, when you don't have the opportunity to finish your quilt, you have a tendency to put a string with a needle sticking in it. It's not necessarily a horrible thing, but if someone else grabs that blanket and doesn't see this and doesn't double check, you know, they said it was a pin, but it could have been any sharp. You know, if you're not a sewer, this to you might be a pin.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is just as harmful as a stick pin. Matter of fact, this might be more harmful than a stick pin because it's a lot closer to a deadly weapon. So let's not put these needles, if you don't finish the stringing before you leave, let's just put the needles back in here. You can always get another needle. I'd rather waste the yarn than, you know, lose the needle or have it end up in a kid. And let me put that not in the blanket, but in the thread. All right, now, just because this is the way we've always done it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't improve on what we've done. So does anyone have any suggestions? I'm open to
your suggestions you took care of.